start the recording. Okay, so welcome to the second session. So just look at what we're going to cover today. We're going to do a quick refresher. We're going to talk about a little bit of advanced CSS and then using CSS frameworks like Bootstrap. And then we're going to look at some JavaScript. But first, we do just quickly have a poll just to talk about some of the content that we covered last time and just sort of your opinions on it. So we'll just get Abu to check up that poll and we'll give you guys a minute to answer it.
Recording in progress.
Alrighty. I think we have everybody answered on that one. So perfect. All right. That's handy. We'll use any of that feedback to just try and help drive how we do any of the future sessions. So, okay, let's get into it. So slides and the exercise files can be found on the website and at the exercise files link. So just a quick refresher from last time. So HTML is basically what provides the structure and sort of the content of a web page. It has a start tag, an end tag, and then we have like the inner content and the attributes, and all of that sort of makes up the actual elements is what we call them for HTML. And then CSS sort of defines how HTML looks. So that's the color, the size, anything that sort of looks, however it looks basically is defined by the CSS. So with that, which of the pages here corresponds to the HTML that you can see in this bottom corner? All right, I think we've got quite a few of the people there. So it looks like we got a split decision between A and C. So C is the answer in this case. So one of the things with this, when we're taking a look at it, is that when you're looking at the big class there, you can see that the background color for the .dark is only for classes that have dark. And since that top div doesn't have that dark class, it actually wouldn't be the black background color, which is why A would be possible. So in this case, it'd be C. Okay, now the next one is what shows up with this code? Cool, I think we got everybody in there. Yeah, so in this case, it would be B in this case, just because the .dark class that's there is sort of the opposite of what you would expect. So one of the points with this is keep in mind whenever you're looking at class names don't always mean what you think they mean. Somebody can have a dark class that they have, and that can do something really stupid. Like, for example, make the dark class have a white background, which is the complete opposite of what you want. So in this case, it would be B. That's the correct answer. Okay, and one last refresher, we're going to do a quick exercise. So if you pop open the /exercise, and that's called refresher, this is sort of what the page looks like. So what you're going to want to do is this top section here, you're going to want to change the background color to 3E, 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 but just for this section. And then from there, try and make all of the fonts sans serif. So currently they're all serif fonts. So make all of them sans serif, except this list. This list you want to be cursive. So I'll give you guys a couple minutes to give that a shot. So with this one, I'm actually also just going to cover it just while we're in the main breakout room here. Just because I know that there was some stuff going on. So as we're taking a look at this, one of the first things to notice when you look at the actual HTML that you were given. So the first thing that you want to style is basically these two parts here. This is what was the stuff that was originally just sort of the gray. That's sort of what you want to color. And if we look at this, essentially it's wrapped inside this div that has a header on it. So what we can actually do here is just come into the header and then add the background color. And that'll basically color just these two elements how we want. So if I go ahead and take a look at it, we can see we have the color how we want. Now for the fonts, we basically wanted it to be on sort of everything except for the unordered lists. So what we can actually do here is on the content class here, which is basically this one that's part of the div, that's on the outer div here. We can just go ahead and add in sans serif, which will make everything the sans serif fonts. And then what we can do is with the UL, which is the thing that we're trying to target to make it cursive, we just go in and change it to cursive, and we'll end up with the correct sort of look from there. So basically just a couple of different ways of targeting things and then just making a couple of those quick changes from there. Okay, so onto the advanced CSS. This is where things start getting fun. So the first one that we're looking at is what's called a pseudo selector. So basically this is sort of like, some people call these state selectors as well. What this allows you to do is basically it lets you select things based on sort of the state of the element. So as an example, when you look at something like links, or if you look at like any element and you hover over it, you can change what happens. So you might have like a button, for example, here with this text where it turns green whenever you hover over it. Or if you have like an actual sort of like button that sits on a web page, you might make the text larger, make it like expand or pulse when people are hovering over it, something like that, right? There are a ton of different pseudo selectors, and they're used for a whole bunch of different states, and they're available on different elements, and different elements will have different ones available. Hover is basically used for most of anything. And all that you do is you type in whatever selector you want to use, and then you use a colon. So you can see here we say A, and then we do a colon and then hover. And the colon hover part is basically the pseudo selector. And so that's how you can do a bunch of really fancy things based on the state of whatever you're looking at. The next thing to look at is media queries. So media queries are cool. They're basically a similar sort of idea. They're just sort of like if statements about the state of the page, but they let you they're an if statement about the state of the browser instead. So the pseudo selector sort of gives you the option to have sort of changes based on the state of the elements. Media queries let you change based on the state of the browser. So there's a whole bunch of them, but some of the cool ones are things like max width. So let's say, for example, you have something where you want to have you only want to have a certain style up until a certain size of phone or device or whatever you're using. Then what you can do is you can set the max width so that up until the point that it hits that width, it will stay whatever you have inside the CSS. And then after that point, it'll just ignore it. And so these basically work exactly like if statements, and you can think about them that way for the most part. So you just do @media, and then in brackets, you put whatever the condition is. So @media, and then you say max width, and then 600. That means that anything inside here will only run whenever you have the browser window at 600 pixels or less, basically. And you just put regular CSS inside this. So here's how it looks. So you can see here, max width 900, and then we go ahead and we put all this stuff in here. And that's basically all you have to do for it. Keep in mind that order does matter. So in this case, because you're saying that 900 pixels is the thing that you want to happen, if you put the 300 above, then everything that's at the 900 pixel mark is also it would be like up until the 300 would be there as well. So it would basically trigger both of them, and whichever one comes last is what would be activated. So in this case, you want it at the very end so that it stacks upward, essentially. And if you forget that, just flip them around. If you run into bugs, that's probably what you're doing. So just flip them around if you see problems with it. Min width is the exact same, but the opposite. So if you want something that starts at 600 and goes until infinite, sort of infinitely big, then you can just do it with min width instead. Next is print. This one's kind of cool. You can do it for whenever people hit the print button on the keyboard. So whenever they hit Control P, for example, it'll go ahead and, well, in this case, it'll generate a preview. But on most pages like this, for example, we can hit P, and we can see here, this is like what it looks like when you're trying to print it. And you can see how this doesn't look great. So what we can do is we can actually add in these print style sheets, and then this stuff will only appear when people are trying to print it. Super handy if you have something like a resume generator. I actually use this in ECCV to has part of the resume generator so that when you print, it prints nicely. And when you're on the web page, it looks nicely on the web page. So here's an example of what that looks like. Screen is just the opposite. So if you want things to only appear when they're on the actual screen, you can do it with that as well. Okay, so what we're going to do is use media queries to basically resize items so that they take up 50% of the screen when they're below 500 pixels. So essentially this hello world, you can see here as we shrink down and we hit 500 pixels, it's going to go from taking 100% of the page to taking 50% of the page as we go. So give you guys a chance to give that a shot. So yes, taking a look at this question. Initially, when we're taking a look at it, the code originally just had this div with 100% width. So all that we have to do is just add in the max width check here. And then when that max width is the case, we just want to make that div go down to 50% instead. So if we go ahead and take a look at it, just promise you it works. We open up the dev tools, this all comes through. And it works properly. So now the next thing that we're going to talk about is display. And so display basically changes how elements sort of talk to each other and how they interact with each other on the page. So if they should show up next to each other or if they should be on separate lines, this kind of thing. So what we've seen so far is that whenever we have an HTML element, they sort of stack like on top of each other and then they go from there. So what we can do with display is force them so that they show up in line next to each other, basically. So block is the default. And so this is used, it's just the default. You don't even have to specify it for the most part, but basically this will have things stack on top of each other. So you can see here, we have two different H1s. They stack one after another vertically. If we do inline instead, you can see the two pieces of text stack next to each other. This can be used to sort of get that sort of shape that you see, like, for example, on the Children Ignite site. If you come in here, you see how these are stacked next to each other. These are all three different elements, but they're all stacked next to each other. This would be done with something like an inline. Now, inlines are great. The problem with them is that you cannot specify the width. So if you put something inline next to each other, you can't tell it how big it's supposed to be. So what you can do instead is you can do an inline block, which will basically let you set the paddings and the margins on the block as well. So you can keep it so you can say, like, I want to have like this sort of a gap or whatever it is. Then you can put that on an inline block, but it has to be an inline block to do that. Okay. So with that, we basically have the starter code that's available. So I'll just pop it open. So this is for display types. It's open. So this is what the starter code looks like right now. And basically what you're going to want to do is try and make it look like, try and make it look like this. So you can see here, the image is supposed to be all stacked up next to each other on the left-hand side. And then we have the text here, and then we have these texts sort of in 3 columns. So that's what you're going to want to do. Just change that into this. So I'll give you guys a couple minutes to give that a shot. Alrighty. So taking a look at this one, most of this was just sort of flipping things around as we went. So generally speaking, when you're looking at display types, the thing to think about is sort of what you're trying to solve. And there's usually just an answer of like which one you want for that. So in this case, we want the elements to line up next to each other. That's always going to be inline. They need them to line up next to each other. That's going to be inline. For stacking the elements vertically, you need them to stack like blocks, sort of like you would have like kids blocks in like a dentist waiting room or whatever, like the ABC blocks that you stack on top of each other. If you want to be able to have something that shows up next to each other, but also are separated, this is the inline block. And that's where you have sort of the width that you can set on it as well. And that's how you get that to work. If you have a super wide screen like I do, this bottom bit might look a little bit weird. If you grab it and make it a little bit smaller, you can see it is in 3 columns. So. Okay, so positions, this is also super handy for this one. When you're taking a look at it, we have this as like a reference and resource you can take a look at. It's a little bit more complicated. One thing that's handy about this is for stacking elements, so sort of like the 3D aspect of stacking things. So if you want to have like, let's say a common thing with apps is having like a button that you click and this like the sort of actions that pop up behind, that's usually done with positions, and that's with absolute and relative, so that you have sort of the stuff that's stacked underneath will sit sort of underneath, and then it gets popped up from there. So if you get a chance to take a look at the position stuff, and then float is the same. This is a very old way of doing left and right. It's actually not recommended to do this anymore, but the reason I put it in here is because people still do it. So if you're interested and want to know if you ever see this, what it's doing, it's basically how you do left and right stuff. And the last one is grid, which is, well, it does what it says in the tin. It lets you create grids. It's also pretty complicated. So we have a breakdown of it that's available at the link there. If you're interested, you can take a look at those. I just don't want to spend all the time sort of talking about different positioning systems, but they're basically all for different reasons. So you can take a look at different ones and see which ones sort of suit what you're trying to do. So as you can probably guess, CSS gets really long with big sites, because obviously if you have to like add in a CSS line to like change every little different piece of font and the different sizes and all that sort of stuff, it gets really long. The main CSS for the Shield Ignite site used to be 9,500 lines. I think it's a little bit longer than that now. It will be shorter in the future, but basically, how do we go around and make sites that look good that don't take like years to build? I helped write that site. I can tell you right now, I didn't write 9,500 lines of CSS. There wouldn't be a Shield Ignite site if I had to do that. So what do we actually do about this? CSS frameworks. Basically steal the code, but steal it from people who want you to steal it, essentially. So what CSS frameworks are is they're sort of a built-in sort of solution that you can get, so you can just sort of grab off the shelf and start using it to build a site. These are super handy to get sites started, super handy for people who are just starting off to be able to have something that looks good right off the bat, and they cover a lot of things that you might not necessarily even think about as well. So they're really handy to use. So there's a whole bunch of different ones. We're going to use Bootstrap, which is one of the most popular ones. Specifically, we're going to look at Bootstrap 5. When you're looking at any of the documentation, we are using Bootstrap 5. So if you use a different version of Bootstrap that you download, then you'll have problems. The documentation, there's a link for it right there. There's a whole bunch of different ways of doing it. So you can download the CSS file and have it directly in your project, as well as the JavaScript files, do all that stuff. We're going to do something a little bit different called a CDN link, and we'll talk about that in a second here. But also, just if you are interested, there are alternatives to doing what we're doing right now. There's some other ones to help you make CSS in very different ways. There's a link right there to a blog post that we wrote that went live on Monday talking about exactly what those different ways are. So if you're interested in that, you can take a look at that as well. So like I said, there's a ton of reasons to use CSS frameworks. It solves problems you probably never heard of. Was one of the main ones I talked about, like, for example, screen readers or right to left. Arabic goes the opposite direction to English. So does some Cyrillic texts and Tamil and a bunch of other stuff. So when you're designing things for different websites, it flips everything the other way around. And CSS frameworks handle a lot of that for you. So weird things like that you wouldn't necessarily think about, CSS frameworks handle it for you. So with Bootstrap, stuff gets kind of a little bit long. So what we've done is there's actually a link right here that I will go ahead and I'll also check this in the chat. Right there. And that is an extension for VS Code that will let you automatically generate some of the HTML stuff. So similar to what we've been doing before, where we've been coming in here and we've been writing like the hash and then hitting enter and then getting all this stuff. We're going to use a same sort of thing called quick snippets. And for this one, we can do the exact same thing, but we type in BS5 with a $sign like that. And when we hit enter, it's going to generate all of the HTML we need. So it's generated the link to the CSS. So it'll download the CSS style sheet for us, and it'll go through and it'll download the JavaScript that's used for Bootstrap as well. So we don't have to touch anything. You just type in BS5 and it'll just create this page for you. You don't have to worry about it. So I'd recommend downloading that as well. Okay, so we're going to build a site as we go. We have this example site. This is going to be kind of the easy example site that we'll have here. There'll also be 2 other example sites as we're going through exercises, but we'll actually be building a couple of different sites as we go. So the principles that we will be talking about are specific to Bootstrap, but the components and the terms that we're using are specific to Bootstrap, but the solutions are pretty universal. So you don't need Bootstrap to do these things, but Bootstrap just provides all of these things in one nice package. So we're going to start with Shield Ignite. Would you believe that the Shield Ignite site was written with Bootstrap? Like I said, I'm kind of lazy. The 9,500 lines of code are from Bootstrap. That's what we're using for the Ignite site. So we'll take a look at how we solve some of the challenges that you'd find in regular web development on the Ignite site and how Bootstrap helps you do that. So the first thing is, how do people actually get to any of your content? Once they actually get to your site, what are they supposed to do? The main way that you want to solve this is with something like a navbar or some buttons as well. So we'll come back to the buttons in a little bit, but first let's talk about sort of navbars. So when we're taking a look at the Shield Ignite site, for example, there's a navbar at the top. So if I go ahead and pop up Shield Ignite, we can see here there is a navigation bar at the top where people can get to the different places they're looking for. There's also the stuff in the footer as well. But at the top here, we basically have the things that they can get to. We have like drop-down links where we can click and see different things. And all of that stuff is really handy. And with Bootstrap, the other thing that's really important is that when people go to this on their phone, we go ahead and shrink this down, we also get this, what's called a hamburger menu, which is the exact same thing, except for it's mobile responsive. So this is super important because it means that people can actually use your website when they're on mobile and when they're on their desktop as well. And so navbars, generally speaking, is one of the first places people look to try and find whatever they're looking for if they just landed on your homepage, for example. There's other types of navigations like tabs as well. So I have a link, the picture of it right there, as well as a link to it if you're interested with Bootstrap 5. And the other thing is like buttons. And so with buttons in Bootstrap, they're used for more than just navigation stuff as well. But there's two different types. So there's a CSS class, which is BTN. And that CSS class can be used to make either a button or an anchor tag look like a button. And then there is the actual HTML element itself, which is actually an HTML element. So if you take a look at this, there are two different types of buttons. So we can have something like an anchor tag, for example, in here, and that anchor tag could have a class of button like that. That's one type of button. The other type of button is literally a HTML tag called button, which you could also put the class on as well. So you could have class of button as well, like that. The difference is that buttons do not support links like this. So if you want to link to somewhere else, you cannot do it with a button. But what you can do with a button is later on when we talk about JavaScript, you can actually fire a function of JavaScript using a button. So any sort of stuff that you want to have happen on the page, you can actually fire it with a button itself. So any links, anchor, anything that's like fancier with like JavaScript, button, essentially. And both of them need the class on there as well. The other place that we use buttons is when we're looking at the nav, the actual HTML. So again, you never want to copy this HTML from anywhere. So if we go ahead and actually open up the Bootstrap 5 documentation, and we go ahead and let's just go to the latest version, and we go to nav bars, and we take a look at this. This is what the nav bar sort of HTML looks like. Always just copy this. There's also the option inside of that snippet system to do it. I think it's just bs5-nav. Yeah, so right there. So bs5-nav, and then I can say complete, and that'll give me all of the sort of nav stuff from there. So you always want to generate that. The important thing when you're looking at this HTML, you'll have to change the links down here, these nav items, this list item. That's where you put the links to different pages. And you have to change this ID. So this ID needs to match this data-bs-target here, because that's how the hamburger menu works in mobile. So that's the big thing. So when we're looking at the If You Look Ignite site, for example, and we take a look at it, the way that it knows what you're trying to do when you click this link, this little hamburger link here, is with that target. So make sure that you give it the right ID, otherwise it won't work properly. That's the only thing you have to change. And you can come back to the slide and take a look at that as well. You have to memorize that. Just keep that in mind when you're changing it. Okay. So now that we have sort of the nav bar built out, how do we actually get people to stay on the page? So there's a ton of ways to get started. Bootstrap 5 actually gives us examples of how to do this. It's what's called a hero. So if we click on this link that's available in here, there's actually a page on Bootstrap that gives you examples of various different things that you can create, and it gives you just the code that you can copy directly from the page. So if we take a look at something like heroes, for example, these are what you would put at the top of a page to capture people's attention. And so when we're taking a look at this, these are sort of different examples. You can see here with the University of Calgary, we have these like nice little pattern things that exist here with like the giant piece of text right there. You know exactly what this page is about. Without having to visit it, we know it's about an open house that's available on October 22nd. With this, we know, okay, this is about like a product. And we know that this is about If You Look Ignite, right? It's something to grab people's attention and tell them exactly what your page is about and set it up really quickly. So what we're going to do for the rest of this session is, as we're going through these exercises, you can kind of pick whatever you want to build a site about. It doesn't have to be any of these options. But what we're also going to do is we're going to give you guys a couple of different options that you can start if you don't really have an idea of what sort of a site you want to build. So if you want to build the same sort of sites that we have 3 different options available. So we have pair, which is under exercises /design1. There'll be the logo and all of that stuff that's available for pair. And you can use this to build out the same sort of page that you're seeing here. There's also Metvein, which is in exercises design 2. This is sort of a more difficult option if you want to try and give this a shot. The content basically is available for you. You have to try and rebuild this design yourself. And then the third one is One in a Chameleon, which is basically a page about buying reptiles, basically. So you can pick whichever of those 3 you want, or you can make your own site about whatever you want as we're going. So for this first section here, what we're going to get you to do is basically just create a page and put a navigation at the top, and then put a hero as well. So that's what you're going to be going into the breakout rooms for. Okay. So now that we have the nav bar and the hero, now that we got them hooked, all right, what do we want to actually do? So we got to write some content. So when we're taking a look at something like this, for example, besides the sort of obvious crime of being boring and uninteresting, most of you could probably make it through this page. If you saw this page, you're like, yeah, okay, 3 sentences, whatever, who cares? Okay. What about this page? You going to be bothered enough to actually get through to the end of this? Well, this kind of sucks, so probably not. Maybe you will. Maybe you'll just skim over it. What about this sort of a page? And so the interesting thing about this is that I'm going on a limb here and saying probably number 3 here is probably more popular than number 2. And it's kind of weird to think about, but the right one actually has 25% more text than the left. Yet it feels a lot more approachable because it's broken up in different places. Humans, generally speaking, need things to be grouped into different sections as you're coming through to try and actually absorb the information. And so the right-hand side basically does that much better than the left, which makes it much easier to actually like take in the information as you go. So how can we actually present some basic info? Well, even just something as simple as breaking it up into a couple of columns with some headings might be handy. So this is all in Latin, which isn't very helpful. But if you imagine, for example, this was something about like, I don't know, like how to do programming, and you're like, what topics are you going to cover? And it's like lists, strings, and loops. If we just had a thing here that says list, string, loop, and then we had a sentence each about it, it'd be much easier to read than like one chunk of paragraph that just talks about like what you're going to cover. So the way that you actually present the information is important, and breaking it up this way can be super handy. So with Bootstrap, we basically have a thing built in called grid. So essentially the way that works is we start with a container, which is just a div that has container on it. And then you have a row. You can use these snippets that are available here, or honestly, it's easy enough that you can generally just go like this. So you say div.container. Then I'll create a div that has a class of container. You do div.row. That'll give you a div with a class of row. And then inside here, you put your columns, however many columns you want to have. So the way that Bootstrap works is you can have a total of 12 columns, and whatever numbers you have, basically just add up to 12. And if they go over 12, it'll break to a new line. So you get 12 columns worth of space, and everything is based on those number of columns. So like a 1 column thing would be 1/12 of the total space, essentially. 6 columns would be 50%. 4 columns would be 1/3. 3 columns would be 1/4 of the total space, essentially, as you're going through. So this is documentation on it, but basically that's the basics of it. So if we're looking at this, if we want to do 3 columns, then we'd have a 4 column size set of 3 columns, essentially. That would make up 100% because 4 plus 4 plus 4 is 12. And 12 is 100% of this month. So there's some more resources about the CSS grid if you're interested. But the easy way to do this that's super lazy is you just put a class of call on anything, and it will just divide it automatically for you. So if I go in here and I say div.call times 3, this would be a 3 column layout for me instead of having to put like call -4 for each of these. Now, if I did call -3 here, and then these ones would have to fill in the rest of the space essentially. So it'll basically, the column just basically says automatically take up the rest of the space that's available on the current line. So now if we took this paragraph on the left-hand side here, we put it inside sort of 3 different things that are split up. We can see here it's a little bit easier to read. This assumes that you can break up the sentence this way. If you can't, don't. Like if you have like 1 sentence over here of a paragraph and then like the next sentence here, that's not actually easier to read. That's just more annoying. If it has to be a paragraph, leave it as a paragraph. But if you can break it up into sort of like these sections, that's a good idea. And so you can see here, we just put that inside of 3 div call classes, and now we get 3 rows. Or 3 columns, rather, sorry. So one way we can do it to make it look a little bit better is actually just make one part of it bigger than the other. So we can see here, we can use heading tags at the top, and then we can put paragraph tags underneath it to basically say like, hey, this is like a heading for this section. And then it says like this information. This is a heading for this section and all of this, right? And this text is actually part of the Schulkenite website. It's actually right here on the homepage. You can see it right here. So this is a 3 column layout that we're looking at here that has this heading, and then we have some text underneath it. And if we were to stuff all of this together, it would be 1 big paragraph and it would be awful. So you can actually see what it would look like right here. Not very good, not very easy to read. So Okay, what we're gonna do with this is I'm actually gonna combine this exercise and the next exercise. So we're just gonna quickly skip this one, but basically this is using that sort of breakup component. But the next thing that we're gonna talk about is icons. And I think icons actually fit really well together with the grid stuff as well. So we're gonna combine them together. So yeah, if we want to spice it up, what we can do is there's a link right here that'll let you download another CSS file that lets you do icons. And you can see basically what it'll let you do is you can chuck an icon in the same columns and break it up that way as well. So when we're taking a look, there's some other alternatives to these Bootstrap icons that you can use from somewhere else. But essentially what we do is we can go to the reference site, which is available right here. And let's say we want like a clipboard, for example, I can just type in clip and I see, okay, there's a clipboard, click on that. Okay, this is the thing that we need. We need this right here. And I can copy that and go. So super easy. If you don't want to use the style sheet either, so you don't want to bother to bring in that Bootstrap style sheet that we saw before, what we can do instead is we can actually just copy this. That's the SVG, so that'll actually draw it for us on the page. And icons themselves are text, so they will change based on your font size. Keep that in mind. So unlike regular images where you have width and height, if you're using the icon, like the eye, it'll change with your font size. So if you increase your font size, it'll get big. So just keep that in mind. Alignment can be super handy as well. So what you can do with this is you can put a class for text-center, for example, to center everything in the text like that. So if you have 3 columns that are sitting on top of each other, typically what you're going to want to do is center it because it looks a lot better than if they're all left aligned like this, where you can see this stuff over here. If we center it, everything sort of stacks on top of each other nicely. Much easier to see. So yeah, examples. This is the Schuylkill Knight site where we have the 3 columns right here. And then this is something on the University of Calgary site where they've gone the other way around, where they have the icon off to the side and then they have everything stacked on top like that. Okay, so now basically what you can try and do is use the information from one of those example sites to add in sort of a couple columns worth of content. You can try also changing the text color if you want as well to match some sort of a color theme. And then, or if you're talking about a different type of site, you can do whatever you need to do. You can see here from Metvane, I didn't use it, but for the, I didn't use icons, but for this one I did. So give that a shot, give that a whirl, give you guys a chance to try it out. So now that we have those icons, we can group things together. We can also do something a little bit fancier. So this is what's called a card. So a card basically is just some sort of like unit of information that you want to put together. So they can be 12 columns wide as far as like taking up 100% of the screen. They can take up like a third, whatever you sort of want to do. They're generally used to group content together. So you can see here, on this case, they're sort of talking about the different features that are available for a certain site. On the Schuylkill Knight site, they're used to sort of show off each of the different sessions individually. On the UCalgary site, we can see here it's got like 3 different pieces of information about a program. On this one, it's talking about different sponsors and what they're doing for. Essentially, there's like a sort of unified, we have like this piece of information that's sort of the same, but it needs to like communicate something different across each of these different pieces. So the same sort of like layout, but not quite the same content. And you can use cards in groups together to sort of make that content. So the easiest way to do it is, well, a card is just a div. So the outer class is called card. And then you have the card body, which is another div inside of it, which then has a title and some text. So super easy. That's how you create just a regular card. And then from there, you can put the column on the card to make it a certain size, essentially. And you can group them together. So you can see here, I have sort of a 4-column layout right here. And you can see that I can basically stack them 3 ways apart and have them all show up like that. You can basically use this for BS5-card-grid. That's basically the snippet. So if we go in here, come in and we say BS5-card-grid like that, hit enter. You can see here, it gives us a row with all this stuff. So I can get rid of this row right here. You can get rid of this row. And you can see here, now we have 2 cards. They're 4 columns wide, essentially. So they take up a third of the screen as you go. So you can just use that snippet whenever, if you want to get it all generated for you automatically. Okay, colors, sizes, etc. Most of these are pretty similar. So BG dash and then some color will basically be whatever color you want. So BG dash dark, for example, will give you like a dark background. And if you wanted dark text instead, you'd say text dash dark. And that's essentially what you do for anything. Any of those like cards, for example, if you have a card, you say card and you say BG dash dark, and it'll make the card dark. And then you want to make the text white, you do text dash white. And the colors are available right here. So if I go ahead and click this, we can see here we have all the different colors that are available right here. And it'll say color text BG primary. And then you can just go through there. And that's basically how you would set it up. So any colors, anything like that are all available just directly in the documentation. You can just read up as you go through. So the real power on Bootstrap is what happens when you have mobile support. So essentially with this, it'll automatically resize everything for you on the mobile devices however you want. So as we talked about before with those column layouts, the thing that's handy about that is that you can specify the columns for the sizes. So this is basically just doing that media query stuff we were looking at earlier, but it does it for columns. So what we can do with this is as we're taking a look at it, we can see here, we have like a medium device here. So anything that is up to 768 pixels wide, we can say .call. So let's say, for example, we wanted to have something that went to medium. So call -medium-4, and then we say call -medium-4. What this does is that it will stay at a 4-column layout until it gets smaller than a medium size, and then it will default to 12. The default is always 12 if you don't specify it after you have that. So this will allow us to have a 3-column layout that takes up like a third of the page with each card until they get to a small size, like on a mobile screen, and then it'll take up 100% of the size. And if I did something on here where I said call large 6, like that, then what that would do is that would say that when the screen is large, this one will take up 50%. When it's medium size, it'll take up 4 columns. And when it's small, it'll take up 12, essentially. So we can have it basically have 2 cards next to each other at the large screen, 3 cards next to each other at the medium screen, and then 1 card when we get to small. So super handy, basically. So yeah, so the pattern is basically .call and then -size -columns. So .call whatever size you want, and then -columns. 99% of the time, you can just get away with just having medium on there. So if I do .call .medium, then what that does is that essentially if you have something that's like large or whatever, then it would also still be at 4 columns. And then when it gets small, it goes down to 12. This basically solves most of your problems if you just want to do something simple. If you want to do something fancier, then you have to break out all the different sizes, essentially. So yeah, this is exactly what I was talking about. So when we're looking at this on mobile, we have, so on desktop, we get 2 next to each other because it's large. So it takes up 50% of the space each. And then on mobile, it takes up 12. But we don't actually need this call small 12 here. We can get rid of this because it's implied always. So there are alternatives to cards. So instead of just doing a card for your grouping, you can also do the old zigzag is what I call it. I don't know what it's actually called. But basically you just do 1 image text and then flip them and then keep flipping them as you go down the page. So that's one option. Or this is what the card equivalent will look like in there. Okay, so the last step for this for the CSS stuff is to try to make your site mobile friendly. So you can pick a layout, whatever one you want, but I would recommend doing a 4 or 3 column layout where you have 3 cards next to each other on everything up until mobile, and then it shrinks down. You can pick whatever you want. We'll give you guys a couple of minutes to give that a shot. And that's what it looks like on the other side as well. Okay, I think everybody is back in here. I apologize if there's any confusion. I thought I mentioned it when we brought up the exercises, but in the exercises themselves, there's actually these 3 folders for design 1, design 2, design 3. And that includes all of like the images and everything that you need. You didn't have to go out and like search for those images. I apologize if that wasn't super clear when I was first talking about that. Okay, so hopefully that all sort of went well with that being said. There's a bunch of other components that are available in Bootstrap. So generally speaking, the card would be one example of a component. The nav bar would be one example of a component. Basically, each of those components are sort of the things that you plug and play to put pieces together to make a site. So there's other components as well, like the accordion, which is used for if you have a whole bunch of information, like in an FAQ or something like that, you might have an accordion. We have one, for example, on the Ignite sites. If you go under contact, we have an accordion in here because these questions and answers and whatever can get kind of longer. So this just gives people a chance to see sort of all the questions at once. From there, we also have a footer for like talking about sort of like how to find you, all that sort of stuff. Any legal information typically goes in the footer. And essentially, this is where those columns basically all come from that system that we were talking about before, where you have like the min width, min height, max width, max height, that sort of stuff. So that's essentially where all those column systems come from. Flexbox is the system that's actually used for Bootstrap. If you're interested, there's a guide here. You can take a look at it. So hopefully all that stuff was clear. Basically, the main thing with Bootstrap is remember, don't memorize things. Just go through and copy those snippets and all that stuff as you go. Don't worry about trying to memorize it. Know what things are used for, and then change those things in your code as you need them. Don't like try and memorize each of those pieces of code off by heart, essentially. So just sort of know, hey, I have a bunch of content that I want to try and group together in different ways. Okay, I'll try and use a card, that sort of stuff. Okay, so JavaScript. So once a page gets loaded, essentially the user asks for a web page, the server sends them back some content. And the question is, after we load the page, what are we supposed to do? Because the user doesn't constantly keep asking the browser to like load the content for them. Sorry, it doesn't keep asking the server to keep loading the content for them. So what actually happens? Well, this is where JavaScript comes in. So JavaScript actually runs on the page, and it can run after the page is loaded from the server. And so it's basically used to modify the page directly. And you can also use it to like maintain a connection to a server if you want to, or start new connections, do any of that stuff. Basically anything that you want, it's a full language. So it defines dynamic behaviors. Like you can see here, whenever I click this button, it's adding one to it. That's basically JavaScript. Basically any verbs on a page will be JavaScript. Like when you click to go and search something, for example, that would be JavaScript, all that sort of stuff. So you can use it same way you can with a CSS file, where you can have either a JavaScript file that you import using the same, where you have like a script and then you can have a source. So you can say like, if you have like a file that's like a .js file, you can go ahead, you can have script, and then you can have src, similar to images, and you can say like /file.js, like that, and that will load the JavaScript file for you. Or alternatively, what you can do is you can have that same script tag that I was looking at right there, and just put your script, and you can just put your JavaScript in here. So you can say something like console.log, like that. So you can just either write JavaScript directly in a script tag, or you can give it a source and it'll load the script tag essentially from that source. Okay, so the basic syntax is you should end your lines of the semicolon. You don't actually have to. It doesn't force you to, but you probably should. Curly braces are used to define function bodies and stuff like that. So if you're not used to this in Python, this is essentially the same thing as indentation levels. So if we have something like an if statement, so if we say like if true, like that, something like that. So if we had some sort of a statement that evaluated true, anything inside these brackets would be the exact same in Python as if you do something like this, where you say if, and then whatever it is, and then you put your content after that. This bracket is essentially the same thing as doing a different indentation level. So anything within those brackets will only run if whatever the statement is inside here is true. So just keep that in mind. That's the same for function. That's the same for everything else. Python is one of the only languages that uses indentation to do this instead of using squiggly braces, is what people tend to call them. So that's what it uses in JavaScript. So JavaScript uses squiggly braces instead of indentation. So basic data types, strings, same thing as Python. They're just strings. Integers, same thing as Python. Floats, same thing as Python. They call them arrays instead of lists, but it's the exact same thing as Python with lists. And JSON objects are the exact same thing in Python as dictionaries. So essentially you have a key, then you have a value. So if you say like, let me grab this page again, we come in here and we say that one in there. So we have JSON is equal to whatever name Kieran, and then we want to get that name back, or let's say instead of calling it JSON, we'll call it user, and then we can just say user name, and that would basically equal Kieran, like that. So whatever you ask it for, it'll find it inside here, basically. Conversions, these are some basic ones. So doing a string to an int, you can use parse int. Doing a string to float, you can do parse float, and then you just pass a string into there. Variables are assigned the exact same way they are in Python. It's nothing super crazy. Types in JavaScript are a bit of a myth. Just keep in mind, unlike Python, it will not throw errors for certain things. So just be careful when you're running JavaScript, because it won't throw an error. It'll just do things that you're not expecting. So keep that in mind. Okay, loops. So there's basically 3 different types of loops in JavaScript. So we have the Python style loops, where it goes through each of the elements. So you say like for element in shopping list, for example, in Python. The way that you do that in JavaScript, you say for const element of array. It'll basically go through, it'll give you each of those items one by one, and they'll be assigned to the variable element as you go. You then have the C style, which is if you're used to anything like for I in range, whatever, and then you like say how much you want it. So you start the range from 0. You say while index is less than whatever the array is up here at dot length, then add 1 to it. So essentially go from 0 to the length of the array and then stop at the end. And then a while loop is just a while loop, while whatever the thing is, and then close it up. Any of the conditionals are mostly the same as they are in Python. The only exception is that there are two different types of equals. So the two different types of equals, you can have the double equals like this, which basically just goes through and tries to check if the value is the same. But what this will also do is things like this will be true. If you want to make sure that they're the same data type, you have to use 3 equal signs. So if I said true triple equals true, this would be false. This bottom one here would be false. This one here would be true, because they had to be annoying about it. So this basically checks by value. This checks by whatever the actual type is as well. Just keep that in mind. This is basically a more strict form of equals. Okay, so one thing that's cool about JavaScript is that you can run it directly in the browser. You don't need anything fancy. So if we just go ahead, open up a new tab, hit F12, at the bottom here, we have a thing called the console. We can pop this open, and right in here, we can start typing stuff. So if I say console.log, which is the same thing as doing a print in Python, and we say hello, you can see here, we got some stuff going on. So what I want you to do is basically go through and try and do a loop that will take in, essentially, it'll just go through and it'll print out 1 to 10. So give that a shot. Ignore the convert it to a string. Well, we won't worry about that. Just try going 1 to 10. So we'll give you guys a couple minutes to give that a shot. Let's take a look at this. So basically for this, if we go ahead, and that is way too big. Okay, so in here in the console, so what I did for mine is basically you can just set x equal to 0, just sort of set it to an integer, and then basically say while x is less than 10, just go through and just do this loop inside of here where we say x plus equals to 1, and then we just console.log x, which is basically just printing it essentially. And then we can see here it goes from 0, adds it, goes to 1, prints it 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 essentially. And that's all that there is. Okay, so JavaScript in general as a language is kind of meh. It's just a language. It's not really anything special. The thing that's really cool about JavaScript is that it allows you to basically do what's called DOM manipulations. So essentially, the browser is split up into a section or a system called the DOM, so document object model, where the actual window that you're looking at and the browser are actually an object in JavaScript that you can mess around with. So this is what allows you to do things like extensions, for example, because the browser itself is a JavaScript object that you can change as you go through. So the document is basically the thing that will let you work with the actual elements on the page. So that'll be all of like your tags and all that sort of stuff. And then the window is what lets you work with the actual browser. So that's like the URL, the screen size, the stuff that's sort of outside of like the regular browser interface. So if we're taking a look at a page like this, let's say the Shulk Night page, for example, everything that's in this window, it's handy because I have dark theme. So everything that's inside here where it starts at the red is basically going to be considered the document. Everything above that is the browser. So, or the window rather, sorry. So that's essentially the easiest way to think about it as you're going through. So window, generally speaking, the main thing it's used for is being able to change the location. So the reason that you have href on anchor tags that we saw before, instead of just saying like URL or something like that, is because that's what's used in the actual JavaScript for being able to change it. So window.location, location is basically another object, and then window.location.href is your current URL. So take a look at this, and we go window.location. We can see here, there's a whole bunch of nonsense in here. We go window.location.href. This is basically a window object with a location attribute that's also an object. And then on that location object, we're getting the href. And if we were to change this to say, for example, google.ca, like that, it would go through and it basically redirect me. So that's essentially the way that you can change anything. Essentially, each of your tabs is considered its own window. And then from there, all the content is basically just one big JavaScript object that you can mess around with. So a ton of things you can do with this. Screen size, you can get the inner height and the inner and outer widths and heights. Generally speaking, use the inner, don't use the outer. The outer includes the size of your browser, which is kind of useless when you're trying to do anything like math, because you don't care about the outside of somebody's browser. You care about what's inside the browser. So generally speaking, use the inner options, but the outer is also there. There's other stuff in the browser. The browsers are kind of nuts these days. So there's like databases that are built into the browser, and there's a bunch of other stuff. So if you're interested, you can take a look at those as well. But so the DOM is what we were just talking about. Essentially, every element we look at, the reason that we call attributes on elements, so when we have like an href that's on an anchor tag or anything like that, the reason that we have that is because they're actually objects. So similar to like what you saw in Python, where you have like a class, and that class can have an object that you create out of that class. That is exactly how all of the pages that you're on work. You have each element is basically its own object, and then from there you can manipulate those objects themselves. So you can access them through the document object, and then you can manipulate those element objects themselves after you find them. So the first thing you have to do is find it. So this is where things like ID I was talking about in JavaScript, it makes it much easier to find it if you have an ID. This is because you can only have one on the page. So you can do document.getElement by ID, and then you type in whatever the ID that you have is. That will return exactly one element object, which is the element you're looking for. So if we have something here, we have some text. So we have h1, and then we have an ID is equal to text, some stuff inside here. Then in JavaScript, what I can do to find this is in here, I can do documents.getElements by ID, like that. And then I just type in text, and I'm guaranteed to get this element when I do that. The other ones are a little bit more complicated. These will return arrays, and then you have to search through those arrays to find the one that you want, essentially. The actual elements then have their own data. So .tag name will give you h1, for example, in this case, where we're looking at like this h1 that's available here. The .inner text will give you the text, like I was saying, without any of the tags. So you can see here, there's an anchor tag inside. It doesn't care. It's gotten rid of it. If you could do the inner HTML, however, you'll also get the actual text inside of here, which is why if you're ever overriding the content of an element, override the inner HTML, because if you override the inner text and then you put HTML in it, it will just be plain text. So make sure to just always use inner HTML. There's basically no reason to ever use inner text. So we have one more exercise that we're going to do today, and then we'll save the rest of it for next time. So basically this exercise, you can find it in here. There's basically going to be some HTML. Go ahead and try and find the inner text of the content div and the inner HTML, and then go to Julep and try and find the URL of the page, which I already showed you earlier, and then how to do the inner and outer widths of your browser. So it gives a couple of minutes to try that out.
Before we send you guys off to your last breakout room of the day, can you guys quickly just fill out the feedback form here about the content for today?
So that's basically the content for today. That might have been, seems like it was a little bit more content than we needed. So we're going to skip the JavaScript stuff. We'll cover it in the next session. Next session will be a bit slower paced as well as we're coming through it. But for the end of session exercise, basically the one that we have for today is basically King is a popular rock band that's approached you to create a website. You have 3 different levels to choose from. Just do the one that you want. You don't have to do all 3 like the last time. So you pick which of the ones that you want to do, and you can go from there. So level 1 is basically a coming soon page for the band. This is like an example of it. If you want to do something similar to this, you can take a look at the background property in CSS to be able to load an image and have it be the background. Option number 2 is a single page that talks about them and their work, uses a couple of different elements, all that sort of stuff with Bootstrap. Or level 3 is sort of a multi-page site that has like a nav bar, as well as like a contact page and a footer with some social media links sort of stuff. So you can pick whichever of those 3 you want to do. And I will hand it off to, I don't want to mess this up, I think it's Elian, is that right, for the presentation?
I guess I can kind of introduce Elian. So as I said, Elian is a representative. I think he's actually the lead for Calgary Participate.